That's bucking up against what you just said. Where kids on IEPs
No,
have these
if every
outcomes.
kid had an IEP, it probably would have better outcomes. But when only a few have them, and that IEP often results in removal from core instruction and really great content experts and higher rigor and maybe even higher expectations about what they can do, because we sometimes see an IEP and then lower the bar. That's where it becomes a problem. But if every kid had an individualized education plan, I don't think that's a terrible idea.
I'm Anna.
I'm Darcy.
And I'm Leanne, and we're here to discuss court cases because they teach us how to effectively run special education.
And I'm Stefan. I work in general education, and I'm here to get sped-splained to.
I have an independent evaluation case, which is referred to as an IEE.
I have heard that before.
You have?
Yeah, from Darcy when I edited the podcast last night. She said IEE, and I specifically remember thinking, what is that?
Yeah. So this family has a little kid, little guy, preschool is 3, and which is pretty common to go from birth to 3 and then kind of roll over into the school system with preschool and you're developmentally disabled. And so the kid qualified, going to preschool, went to a primarily gen ed preschool, was doing fantastic in the school setting. Parents routinely came in and complained about the child's toileting, the child's social skills, can't get along in the grocery store. So just had like a lot of concerns like around family structure and how things worked at home. And so they went and got a diagnosis of autism from a private physician and brought that back to the school. At this time, he's 5. And so he's halfway through kinder. And the school says, thank you for sharing this information. We want to consider it and we're going to do a reevaluation. So they launch into a reevaluation and they have the OT involved, they have the SLP involved, of course, they have the school psych involved, and they're meeting with the teachers, doing a checklist. The kid is kind of doing off the charts. Like he's an exemplar. He's doing fantastic.
What's up, little fella?
Yeah, right. So he's doing really well in school. So they get together with the family, kind of have this informal, like, hey, we've got all these results, and there's really a mismatch between what you're reporting at home versus what we're seeing at school. And so this may be a difficult conversation, and kind of gives them that initial report with like all of the results and things like that. So the parents appear not to be happy with that because they refuse to come to 3 eval meetings.
Oh.
And the school is like, no, we're having the eval meeting, and they meet at like 6. They're super accommodating. And they go through all of these things and they find him ineligible for services.
Okay.
Parents file a due process. Well, actually, they request an IEE because they disagree with the evaluation, and the school district files the due process saying that they are going to stand on their evaluation.
They're filing a due process because they don't want to pay for the IEE?
Yep. So school districts have 15 days after the request of the IEE to decide whether to honor the IEE and pay for it or to file due process on the family.
How often does that happen?
Not often enough, in my opinion.
Tell me more.
I think schools do a really good job with evaluations. Like, we have a lot of information on the kids, especially when we've had them for a long time. Like, the kid's been in the school system for 3 years. Like, they know that kid, and they know what that kid is looking like in regards to a typical kid within the school setting. And so I think sometimes schools are like, oh, maybe the parents will feel better if I pay for the IEE. But when you really when you have an evaluation, you have all the information there. They're usually pretty thorough. Like, unless you're missing something super specific, I think it's kind of common practice for schools to go, well, it's only this much money. Let's appease the parents and see if we can avoid the due process.
How much does an independent evaluation typically cost?
Around 2,000.
Oh, I guess that's more than I thought.
Oh,
Not that
that's not
schools are
very
swimming
much.
in cash, but
And
No,
sometimes
it's not much.
the
Yeah.
school district appreciates some additional information, some testing that maybe they can't actually provide. But in this case, there was no concern that the student would be eligible for an IEP, regardless of what information would come from a private provider. So that's kind of a drain on the system.
because the threshold for qualifying for an IEP is standard deviations and impact on education, right?
3-pronged
Three
test.
pro.
That means nothing to me.
You have to have a disability.
Okay.
Which, yes, sometimes 2 standard deviations, but that's not exact. There is professional judgment. And then also,
Not necessarily a diagnosed disability. Like you don't necessarily.
well, there has to be evidence through testing.
Right, but you don't have to have a piece of paper from the doctor saying you have autism.
Not a medical diagnosis, right. So you have to meet one of the 14 categories of eligibility. And then educational impact and need for specially designed instruction. And it sounds like this child had the disability of autism, but maybe didn't meet the other 2 prongs.
Yes. So I think the 3 prongs are suspected disability and adverse impact to education. And those 2 alone will qualify you for a 504, which is what they recommended for this kid at the end of the meeting. And then the 3rd prong is the need for specially designed instruction, which they said he obviously didn't need based on all of the assessments.
And one of the hard things for families and I think for doctors to understand is just because you have a diagnosis of a disability doesn't mean you need specially designed instruction. Like a diagnosis of autism does not automatically qualify you for an IEP.
I was going to ask you to explain that to me, but this is the perfect example of that, right? Like this little fella has autism, but is crushing school. Could you run back what triggered the parent request for this? It was
That they disagreed with him not qualifying for an IEP.
sorry, before that, like it was you had said something about like behavior at the grocery store and like getting on. What were those things?
So it sounds like, which I don't think is all that unusual, school is super structured. And so he was doing really well in school. But at home, that was not the situation, according to parents, was that he was blowing out at the grocery store. He'd lay on the floor and lick the floor and kind of, didn't have any friends at home, supposedly. So, like, the neighbor kids didn't want to play with him. So what the family saw outside of school, because the family's not in school, so they don't see him doing well. They see him at home having accidents and not having any friends and laying on the floor crying when anything happens unexpectedly.
And saying like this must be happening at school too, for lack of a better term, and not that this is what the school was saying, but is essentially not our problem. Like, I mean, these things are happening, and that's a bummer. And school systems will probably hear strategies, and we want to support you. But when you're talking about IEP and using school district services, if it's not happening at school, it's not the school's problem.
Yeah, kind of at the end of the day. I mean, then we do a lot with families that could do structure and things like that, but without seeing anything from the school end, like there's not a lot of in-home services that schools are going to offer.
Gotcha. So in this case, school did the eval, wanted to have I'm just reminding myself, wanted to have a meeting. The parents were like, we're not doing it because we don't like what we're going to hear.
Right.
And so they bent over backwards, 6 o'clock at night, which is wild. And they show up there. Had the parents gone to go get an independent evaluation, or they just like threatened to do it?
So when they got the autism diagnosis, they had done that on their own. So then once you have a re-eval meeting, so they have to say, I disagree with this evaluation,
Mhm.
which they did, which was which started the request for the IEE.
Gotcha.
And then district said, no, we're not going to do that.
Okay. So then where did the due process come into place? Like they just went and got it and then requested to be paid for, or
So the IEE request goes to the district, and the district said no, and then they're legally responsible for filing due process to prove that their evaluation is sufficient.
oh, it's like a preemptive due process to cover their butt, essentially. What happens if they miss that deadline? You said they had 15 days. Is that 15 school days, 15 calendar days?
Oh, good question.
Ah, someone spent that TRC.
I mean, it's a procedural error for sure. Not all procedural errors result in denial of FAPE, free and appropriate education.
Well, I'm wondering if they like missed that 15-day window to file due process against the family, and then could the family go and get an independent evaluation and be like, "You missed your window, you got to pay for this."
Yeah, that's a great question.
I mean,
I don't know the answer.
I'm sure an attorney would argue that.
Okay. Well, see, now I'm thinking when I said I don't know what an IE is, or I've only heard of it one time, I can just feel Anna glaring at me because this came up once when we were. She's not actually glaring. That was disappointing.
You told the district that we were
Yeah.
going to do an IEE.
Thinking about our own son when we wanted him qualified for services for things that we knew were impacting him before he was in school. The conversation we had with the district was, well, we'll go get our own. I think I literally said independent.
You
evaluation.
did. That's
I
why
mean,
I'm like, how do
parents-
you not know that term? I didn't
Parents
even
can
think you-
do that and bring it to the school to be considered, pay for it themselves. But this is a different process when you're actually saying, I disagree with your findings. I want a second opinion and I want you to fund it at public expense.
Yeah. Well, in our case, credit to the district. Like, no, okay, we'll do the eval, right? We have, because they're equipped to do those things. They have all of those things, those resources in place, those professionals that, and you said knowledge of the student, right? Like you see that kid in that context so much more than the parent ever does. Like I think about that all the time with our 5-year-old. His teacher sees him more on a daily basis than we do in a much more structured environment, and so he's probably a very different kid at school than he is at home. Yeah, I can see how that would be frustrating for a parent. And it's always interesting. This is the second one now that we've done that someone has the district has filed due process against the family.
So I wanted to ask about that because, like you said, the IEE cost is often like $2,000. A due process often costs more than that, right?
It depends
On what? The length.
on how fast that happens, how long the trial takes, whether they're paying an attorney to be there or whether they're representing themselves.
So, cost aside, another reason you might file the due process is, really like demonstrating that we are backing up our staff and that we've done a thorough evaluation.
Yeah, I think another piece of that too is sometimes thinking about like what gets talked about in your community, right? If you're paying out for all these IEEs and everyone's like small school and you have the psych who's the neighbor of the whoever and all those kind of connections, right? If I want to go down that everybody's going to be like, I don't like the way this got done, so I'm going to do an IEE. So it also could be like what's the stance from the district side of that when it comes to those things?
You're setting a
Because
precedent.
your community knows
Yeah.
what's happening and whether that was honored or not.
And I guess I just would assume that saying we want to take family to court is not an easy decision that the district is making.
I would think that there was a lot of unsaid, moments in this case where the family was either threatening due process on their end or it had already put an extraordinary amount of time into doing a very thorough evaluation and they didn't want to put any more time into this where there are children that definitely need this amount of time.
Mm-hmm. I think another piece, because, they only list the facts, right? Like they're not like, this person was mad at so-and-so. So, there's a great big story back here. But the first thing that like puts like this potentially is not a great relationship when the school's like, let's just meet at 6 so that we can get this over with.
Oh, yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Like, how many times can you get like, hey, IEP team of 5 people who are working outside their contract, like, can we just get this done?
But then from the parent perspective, you have a diagnosis of autism, which many people are just going to assume equals an IEP. And then you go in for an IEP meeting and end up getting consent for reevaluation, and now the kid doesn't even qualify. So probably a huge, hit to the expectations that they have.
Well, and frustrating as a parent, right?
Yeah.
I mean, that's new learning for me, that a disability doesn't necessarily, that's this three-pronged approach piece here. I guess in my head, I just assumed that this kid has a disability and so needs individualized, especially designed instruction. And I mean, that's a assumption, an incorrect assumption on my part. And yeah, putting myself in that family's shoes, especially if you're dealing with those types of things at home, right? Like you have this student who is clearly struggling, and maybe a part of that is bucking up against the structure that he is in all day, right? Like, uh, I'll stop talking about our kid, but we see him come home from kindergarten just so tired because it's such a mental tax all day. And you have this student who has a disability who's coming home from school from this very structured environment where it sounds like he's killing it, but now there's going to be just looser structure in the home environment. And like you're going to the grocery store, and there's a lot of like sensory triggers in that scenario. And so, like, I mean, they're probably at their wits' end, or they're probably very frustrated, very, very tired, and they're looking for support. And it cannot feel good to hear from the school district, essentially. Again, not that this is what they're saying, but essentially, he's fine here. I don't know what to tell you.
That's always hard. That wouldn't feel good, because as the school, we're like, your kid's doing great, and we have all this data to show how great they're doing. And sometimes that doesn't feel good to parents because it's such a mismatch from what they see at home. And then they, have a lot of feelings.
And I think, like, I would say our schools do a really good job of saying, okay, maybe they don't qualify here, but there are private therapies, right, that have different qualification, and you can go there. But for families to access those therapies is really hard. So as a parent, it is so much easier to know that your child is taken care of at school and getting those things met at school, where I don't have to take off work. I don't have to drive 45 minutes to that therapy appointment, right? Like all of those types of things, when I know that you guys are qualified to do it and you will do a good job, is really what, like, I hear that parent asking for.
Yeah. I think there's a piece also that I just want to put in the universe of my soapbox, maybe. Outcomes for kids on IEPs isn't great.
Right. Important to say.
Right? I don't know. Sometimes I think we forget that in the lens of what we're fighting for on the family side and the school side. Like, that label alone just reduces potential outcomes for that child. And I'm like, yay, your child doesn't need an IEP. They're doing really well in the school system. That's a huge structure that's going to be in their life for potentially 13 or more years.
Is that so? When you say outcomes for kids and IEPs isn't great, is that because of the label that's put on them? Is that because decisions that are made around tracking them and what they have access to that influences decisions in the school? Is that why?
Yes, all those things. And what they get in gen ed, and what they get for post-secondary, and what classes they get to take in high school when they missed math their entire elementary education, right? So there's all these things when you look at that we don't do a great job. I hate to like be a hater on ourselves, but we don't do a great job with outcomes for kids with disabilities. And that's what it's all about.
Yeah. Well, and you're talking about the K-12 system as a whole, right? It's not necessarily Washington teachers. I mean, it's the United States K-12 system. Something I tell teachers, I mean, I said it just the other day in a district. not even facetiously, like I would kind of love to live in a world where every kid's on an IEP, right? Like you can give every kid exactly what they need because in my head, so that's bucking up against what you just said. Where kids on IEPs understand
No,
everything
if
that's
every
happening.
kid had an IEP, it probably would have better outcomes. But when only a few have them, and that IEP often results in removal from core instruction and really great content experts and higher rigor and maybe even higher expectations about what they can do, because we sometimes see an IEP and then lower the bar. That's where it becomes a problem. But if every kid had an individualized education plan, I don't think that's a terrible idea. I just
Yeah, learning plan.
system.
Right. So let's say you're on this IEP team, you're working in this school, you have this IEP meeting at 6 o'clock at night, and these parents are frustrated, but they understand. They're like, okay, and they ask you, so what do we do at home? You know, like if the answer really is structure, what are some small things you could give to this parent that might set this student up for success? No, let me throw a more difficult one at you. You said like he's having blowups and like licking the floors in grocery stores. What do you do for a parent in that sense? You know,
Yeah, I think my recommendation, like if you want to address specifically the grocery store. So before you go to the grocery store, what do we do at the grocery store? Do we have pictures of how it's appropriate to push the cart in the grocery store? Do we pick things from the bottom shelf? Do we touch the floor? That's dirty. Yuck. Where do we keep our hands? Right. So some of those story things and prepping kids, like when you go on vacation, you're like, we're all going to have fun and we're going to be nice to each other, even if we don't feel like being nice to each other. Right. So, like, it's kind of putting some of those and being probably more clear than you would just normally. Like, we're going to be nice. Like, what does nice look like? What does nice sound like? What do we say when we want to lay on the floor at the grocery store? Oh, can you ask to get in the cart? Yes, we can put you in the cart. Right. So, like, building some of those things so the family has, because if you're not in education, how do you know that that's the structure that you would need to put in place? You'd just be like, we go to the grocery store and everybody knows how to behave because they look at everybody else and go, oh, this is what we do in the grocery store.
gotcha.
But if you can't do that, then you've got to give them some concrete action that they can do.
Yeah, which for parents who are not in education and who like if this is their first child and it's not a typically developing child, then yeah, I can just see. I mean, you said it. Schools are equipped with so many tools and so much experience with students. That's part of the value that they bring to a community is like they are experts in child development. And if your only case of child development is a 3-year-old with autism, that's not a typically developing kid. And so you're not equipped with those strategies to, and so that intentional teaching or that those intentional supports and resources, yeah, like picture stories, right? And uh, those types of conversations. That's something that probably would not have occurred to me. Like, hey, we're about to go into the grocery store. Here's how we act, and here's what I can expect from you, and here's what, yeah.
But as a general education teacher, I'm sure you've had many conversations with parents where they say that their student acts a different way.
With my teaching colleagues, right? Oh, doesn't do that in my classroom. Not sure why he's doing it in yours, but yes, I actually do know why he's doing that in yours, right? And yes, no, totally. Kids are very quick to play mom off dad, and it's a little different when you're talking about a 3 to 5 year old with autism for sure. But yeah, I mean, you see that in a general education setting all the time. It's well, and I mean, I taught middle school, so sometimes it's the opposite. Like he's exhibiting these behaviors. I keep I keep saying he because I'm picturing some of my former students whom I love for the record, but
As they're all listening.
I'm picturing specific students who they're exhibiting behaviors or they're middle school kids, and so they're weird. They're just so weird, and they just do these things. And then you're having conversations with their parents at conferences, and they're like, "Well, they don't do that at home." Like, well, I mean, they're barking like a dog halfway through my class just because they think it's funny. Like, I don't care if they're not doing it at home. It's the behavior that needs to be addressed here for sure. And more commonly, it was let's all, as a PLC, wrap around this student who's exhibiting these behaviors. And it was always an interesting conversation to say, like, well, he's doing it in my class. He's not doing it in Anna's or Darcy's or Leanne's. So what about my set? And that's tough as a teacher to say, like, what about my setting is the issue, because we're much quicker to say, what's this kid's problem, as opposed to is the environment. And it's because teachers are overworked, and it's a rough schedule that we put teachers in, and so being able to step back from that is tough.
And on the flip side, it's hard for those parents to go, what's happening in my setting that's different from what's happening at school. And it sounded like it was a lot of toileting. So that's obviously a very different structure at home than it is at school. When everyone's going, then there's cues.
Yeah, in kinder, you're prompt to go potty, right? We wait in line. This is what we do after lunch, and right. There's a lot of that structure. I think that happens in the school setting. It's always going to be different than home.
And there's a lot of supports that schools can give without an IEP.
That's a good point.
Did you tell us what happened?
Nope.
Well, let's get to that.
So the district was found in favor that their evaluation was comprehensive and the student did not qualify for services.
Which it's interesting. Normally I'd be like, oh, let's get the kid services. But to hear an expert on the subject say, like, good, they didn't qualify for an IEP, which is not something you typically hear from a sped director, but that does make sense, right? That's like, and good for this kid who's crushing it in school.
At the end of the day, good for the kid who's crushing it.
Also doesn't mean that the child will never qualify in the future. So it's important that we tell parents that
Yep.
Right now on track, if it, you can always refer again later, because we know there is a chance that that child will be more delayed at a later grade level. But awesome news.
Yay.
Yay.
What did you learn?
So I learned that I should have known what an IEE was already, because I've used the term several years ago. But independent education evaluations, really my takeaway from this is that schools a lot of times are equipped with a lot of things. Schools are there to help families, and that's not new learning for me. Obviously, that's why we do what we do, is there to serve and support our families. But schools are equipped with a vast amount of resources to be able to support you and use their expertise, and those are things that we should rely on and we should trust. And if I'm a parent, I do have the power, authority, leeway to request independent evaluation. My real new learning here is that a school district can say, no, we've done our job. Like this is on you. And even if you don't like the result, we are the experts in this area and you're going to trust our expertise. And then that family still could have been like, all right, fine, but I'm still going to go do an independent evaluation, right? Oh, so there's a question. So let's say they pony up $2,000 to go do this independent evaluation and the results are different than the schools. What happens then?
They can take that back to the school, and the school will always consider anything from outside sources, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they would qualify automatically.
Would there be an avenue where the family could file due process against the school and it would go?
Yeah, they could come back and say, I got additional information, and they would reopen the eval and they would consider that. And then the school can say, oh, yeah, this is new information. He has trouble pottying at home. It's documented here in this, but he still doesn't have trouble at school. So he still doesn't need specially designed instruction.
Yeah. So in this avenue, I mean, it really is all about that school impact, that impact on the education. Okay. Yeah.
And I think overall schools should use this more often. And I think sometimes that appeasing of the family is like, well, we'll just do this to do it. And then more often than not, schools recommend an IEE because they're missing something, like Dan said. Like, we need this information. This would really help us. And so let's do this and get additional information.